Good morning and welcome everybody to the first in the IGDC webinar series on COVID-19, which will explore different facets of the pandemic and how they relate to global development challenges and research needs. The series has invited speakers to present case studies from across the world to reflect the impact from and responses to the pandemic. So we've got topics ranging from climate justice to the development industry, democracy and authoritarianism today. And we will explore how global development researchers can contribute to a better understanding of the impact of COVID-19 and reducing the likelihood of an impact of future pandemics. Now, this may be your first IGDC event. So just to give it a quick intro, the IGDC is the Interdisciplinary Global Development Center here at the University of York. It's an interdisciplinary learning and research community focused on equitable development. And both my name's Dr. Phil Roberts. I'm a lecturer in the Department of Politics. My colleague, Dr. Indrajit Roy, also in the Department of Politics. We're both members of the IGDC. So, IGDC undertakes interdisciplinary research. It's got a particular focus on social justice, global health, and then sustainable environments. And we're offering both undergraduate and postgraduate academic programs in global development. The center facilitates collaboration among academics from across the humanities, the social sciences, and the natural sciences within the University of York, and globally too, and encourages students and non-academic partners from across the world to both work and to study with us. So that's just a quick intro. Just so that everyone is clear and aware, this session is being recorded, but it's only the video and the audio of the panelists that's being recorded. Attendees' mics are muted and your video is turned off, so you won't be recorded. The only information that might be recorded are any questions that you type in, because they may include your name, which could be identifiable based on your Zoom name. But with that bit of housekeeping done, I'm now going to hand over to Dr. Roy, who's going to introduce this session.
Thanks, Phil. In this first session, we're going to be talking about COVID-19 and the ways in which the pandemic intersects with the underlying political dynamics in two countries that are in fact widely been celebrated or had been celebrated for a while as rising powers, emerging markets, etc., India and Brazil. We want to specifically focus on the complex relationships that both countries have had with democracy and authoritarianism. And these complex relations have been made even more complicated by the pandemic, especially as it hit both countries during a shift to much more authoritarian forms of governance. And many scholars have, of course, talked about these trends, as have activists and commentators. Now, in this session, we want to focus on the ways in which the crisis wrought by the pandemic intersects with the politics of Hindutva in India and the end of the pink tide in Brazil. How it affects the quality of democracy, if you will, democracy broadly indeed, and the potential of movements, political movements, social movements, and other grassroots movements, which may oppose the governments in both countries and try and resist these tendencies. Now, we couldn't have thought of two better people to talk us through the situation in both countries. So we have with us Dr. Harsh Mander, who's joining us from Delhi, and Dr. Sabrina Fernandes, who's very kindly agreed to give her time for this. So thank you to both of you for your time today. Both authors are very well known. They have lots of followers on social media, and they are sort of, very well regarded, so they don't need a lot of introduction. That said, it's probably a good idea to very briefly sort of say a few words about them both. Harsh is an author, a columnist, a researcher, teacher, social activist, many things rolled into one. A lot of us, really respect him for his work on social exclusion, poverty and inequality, and democracy and citizenship in India. Harsh was formerly in the Indian Administrative Service, which is the sort of apex bureaucracy of our country, which Harsh left in 2002 in protest against the mass violence in Gujarat that year. Now, Harsh is perhaps one of India's finest intellectuals, and I know he will shy away from calling himself this or any reference to this. But what he has not shied away from is to criticize the government of the day for its perceived failings. And for this, he is, as you can imagine, not terribly popular among certain circles. But we're very glad that Harsh is here. Harsh is, of course, a longtime friend of York. He's been involved with the Center for Applied Human Rights, CAR, in York, as well as worked closely with the Department of Politics, with me and colleagues on issues of citizenship, especially the Citizenship Amendment Act and the protests around the act that are presently ongoing in India, and the ways in which citizenship is being reimagined. So we're very happy, Harsh, that you were able to make time for today's session. I'm also very, very pleased to introduce Dr. Sabrina Fernandes, who's an academic and an eco-socialist activist. Sabrina, thank you so much for joining us. Sabrina holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Carleton in Canada. Her doctoral thesis was titled Crisis of Praxis, Depoliticization and Left Fragmentation in Brazil. I hope I got that right. And in that thesis, Sabrina examined the ways in which conservative right-wingers capitalized on a crisis of political representation. Your first book, which translated into English, the title would read Morbid Symptoms, The Brazilian Left at the Crossroads, was published last year, if I'm correct. And so many congratulations on that. Sabrina is currently engaged in postdoctoral research at the Federal University of Brasilia, and the postdoc is funded by the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation as part of the International Research Group on Authoritarianism and Counter-Strategies. Besides her academic input, Dr. Fernandes has been deeply involved in activism and political communication, particularly through her YouTube channel, the English translation of which would be Thesis 11. I think this channel does a great job of engaging publics that are left out of traditional forms of political organization. Sabrina is also coordinating the launch of Jacome Brazil. So thank you, Sabrina, for joining us. Thank you, Harsh, and thank you, Sabrina. We're really looking forward to hearing you both. Before I hand over the floor to you both, I just want to remind our audience about Q&A. To ask questions, please click on the Q&A button. Ask questions submitted to this function. After both is successful, so you will take but you're questions. If you have technical issues, we will chat. So questions in the Q&A box, issues in the chat box, please.
Sorry, I can see I was muted there. Okay, so I can see that Indrajit's mic was breaking up there for a second, so I'll just do the technical bit about questions and answers. Please do ask questions during the session, but please use the Q&A tab to do that. Any other issues that you have, any technical issues, please just copy into the usual chat function. So questions in the Q&A and tech issues in the chat, please. I think Indrajit may just be about to sensibilize himself. Can you speak now, Indrajit? Let's see if your mic's working.
Yes, hopefully.
Good.
Great. Thanks, Phil, for taking over. Without further ado, can I invite Harsh to sort of take us through the situation in India? Harsh will speak for about 15 minutes. And when you have 5 minutes left, Harsh will try and sort of wave out to you. We can't in a traditional form, sadly, but I think we have some innovative ways of attracting your attention and sort of telling you that your time's nearly done. After Harsh, we'll move straight on to Sabrina, again for another 15 minutes. And after both panelists have spoken, Phil and I will offer some comments and ask some questions, which will allow both our panelists to elaborate some of their points. So over to you. Your time starts now. Harsh, you need to unmute.
Yeah. So thank you, Indrajit. Thank you, Phil. And great to meet you, Sabrina. The pandemic hit India at a time when democracy was deeply threatened, long before COVID-19 reached the Indian shores, or in fact, reached anywhere. I think that India was already at a moment, I think in independent India, democracy perhaps never seemed as threatened as it did at that moment, barring possibly the 18-month emergency, the political emergency that we had. Although in some ways, the crisis of democracy that we were and are witnessing is even deeper than in an openly declared emergency where formally the constitution is kept in suspended animation. The threat, I think, is from the ideology of the ruling party, the Bharatiya Janata Party. It is intensely majoritarian, it is runaway neoliberal, and it is extremely intolerant of dissent. Let me sort of talk about each of these very, very briefly. I think it's never been a more frightening time to be Muslim in India than it is today. In India's freedom struggle, central to the idea of India in the leadership of Mahatma Gandhi and other leaders of our freedom struggle was the idea that India would belong equally to people of every faith, including the Indian Muslim. Partition tore India apart. There were rivers of blood. More than 1 million people were killed. 14, 15 million people were displaced. And its scars remain. Because Pakistan was constituted on the basis of religion, there was and continues to be a significant body of political opinion which believes that Pakistan is an Islamic country, so India should be a Hindu country. But they are, as I said, a great part of the legacy of our freedom struggle. And Mahatma Gandhi lived for many ideas, but he was killed for this idea that India would belong equally to its Muslim people. I think his assassination for a while seemed to settle the issue and we thought it was settled, and people thought that it was settled for all time. But clearly it was not. India's constitution, led by one of our most revered political figures who stood for radical equality, Baba Sahib Ambedkar, uh, you know, laid out the contours of a nation which promised would be, would secure justice, equal justice for all people, where there would be freedom, liberty, where there would be equality, and above all, where there would be fraternity or solidarity. Um, but this promise was never fully realized, and it has got continuously eroded. And I don't have, in 15 minutes, I cannot take you through this whole trajectory. But the election of Narendra Modi with a full majority in 2014 really marked a decisive sort of watershed moment in India's journey as a republic. Um, and over the last 6 years, because he got re-elected in 2019, uh, I see three kinds of projects that were in play. The first of them was a political project to render the Indian Muslim politically irrelevant. Up to then, political scientists held the view that because Muslims form a significant proportion of the population in several constituencies, an openly anti-Muslim party cannot gain a majority on its own in India. And they set out and they succeeded in proving them wrong. And they did this by actually uniting everybody else across caste and sadly across religious identity, including even the Christians, in a kind of a joint political front against the Indian Muslim. And thereby the Indian Muslim became politically irrelevant. And across not just the BJP, but even the so-called secular political opposition increasingly, uh, found it harder and harder to even speak out against discrimination against Muslims, or to put up visibly Muslim faces as part of their leadership. There was a social project that also played out, and this social project was one of normalizing and valorizing hatred and prejudice against the Muslims. And so we saw in our, in middle class life, in our WhatsApp groups, the kind of prejudice and hatred that began to be aired. Uh, uh, and it didn't stop there. What was even far more frightening was a whole, almost like an epidemic of lynching that played out in different parts of the country. And these lynchings, are to my mind, the closest parallel is the lynching of African Americans. These were performative lynchings, where instead of a crowd gathering, there was the video camera, and there was extreme cruelty with which people were attacked, and this was consumed through the video by very large numbers of people. And the basic, what was communicated was that the lynch mob were the heroes of the Hindu nation, whereas those who were lynched were not victims, but actually the source of the problem. Uh, and it was fitting that they were treated in this way. And so there was as I said, a valorization of this hate violence. That was the social project. I think that, I see a third phase after the BJP got re-elected with an even larger majority. And this was significant because the economy was already in shambles. There were no promises of jobs this time. There were no promises. There was just hard Hindutva that was on offer. And the fact that they got an even larger majority emboldened them to believe that they now had a mandate to actually, in a sense, in a formal sense, change the character of the Indian democracy, to alter, laws, and ultimately possibly the constitution, And so, in conformity with its Hindutva ideology. And so we saw a series of measures, most important of which was what happened in Kashmir, uh, and the erosion and the abrogation of its special status and its reduction into a territory directly administered from Delhi. But I think that there was also this judicial ruling on the temple, the Ram temple, which had great symbolic value at a site where a mosque, a medieval mosque, had been demolished by a mob. So all of this happened, but I think it's for its most important the most important step that it took at that time in this journey to making India, changing India from a secular democracy into a Hindu nation, was a change in India's citizenship laws themselves. And for the first time, religion was introduced as something that everybody except those with a Muslim identity had clearly a greater right and a higher right to Indian citizenship. And that whole imagination that India would belong, it would not matter which God you worship, whether it's Allah or Bhagwan or whether you're Christian or whatever, you're an equal citizen in every way. That was demolished by this. And at that point, we thought that India was, at its, darkest moment, and then something changed, and India had this, protests broke out, the largest set of political protests uh, uh, that India has seen since the freedom struggle, where young people came out across religious identities and working people, and said that no, and the constitution became actually the symbol of the whole movement. So I think that's one part of, so I talked about it being intensely majoritarian. I don't have the time to talk about how it is intensely neoliberal, but it is a regime of crony capitalism, of neoliberalism, with a massive erosion of the very weak social rights that had been built by the previous government. Uh, it, so therefore, it's not only a frightening time to be a Muslim in India, it's also a very difficult time to be a working poor person or a farmer. And finally, it was intolerant of all dissent. And we saw an erosion of various countervailing institutions to the hubris of the executive. We expected, if you expected Parliament to stand as a countervailing force, uh, you saw the political opposition almost, decimated in terms of its moral voice to speak out in favor, especially of the idea of a secular nation in which Muslims are equal citizens. But even on the economic front, its contribution was very weak. The judiciary in India has a very crucial role for a majority not to become majoritarian. Its duty to protect minorities is very, very critical. And we found that too, in there too, it failed. And then there was the erosion of the media, which we found, we had a very vibrant media right through all of this period. But today we have, most of mainstream media is really reduced to being cheerleaders of whatever the government says. And there's even a silencing of dissenting progressive voices in academia and in civil society. So we had these brief, intense hope raised by the anti-CA protests, and then the Delhi violence. Violence broke out, Hindu-Muslim violence. And we had one huge crisis after the rest. This was the worst episode of Hindu-Muslim violence in Delhi after partition, and then the pandemic, and then the lockdown. The lockdown itself.
You have 4 or 5 minutes left.
Yeah, I'll really struggle through what I needed to say. So the decision of a very stringent lockdown in itself, I believe, was extremely undemocratic. who took the decision, who was consulted. Clearly, cabinet was not consulted, the chief ministers were not consulted. And now increasingly it is clear that even scientific opinion within the government was not consulted. It was undemocratic because the lockdown in its very character excluded the poor from its protections. It not only placed enormous burdens, unbearable burdens on the poor, but the poor in the way that they live could never have the protections from social distancing or from washing their hands because they did not live in environments where it was possible to do so. So clearly, the only people who were protected through the lockdown were people in the middle class who had homes where you could have social distance and who could work from home. So I think the undemocratic character of having the most stringent lockdown in the world, even China, even at its peak, had a lockdown for 5% of its population. We had a lockdown for 100% of our population. Uh, and the relief that was provided ultimately was less than 1% of our GDP. We had the migrant crisis where migrants were, not allowed to move, and the suffering of the migrants. We estimate that larger numbers actually walked on foot uh, as migrants than even during partition. And there were double standards. There were, if you traveled by flight, you didn't even require a health certificate. You didn't need to go into quarantine, but the migrants were required to do all of this. What made it even much more frightening was the introduction of the anti-Muslim sentiment in the middle of the pandemic. And this is really, to my mind, it's a spectacular political accomplishment for their ideology, that when we were all locked in within the first week, they took there was one international gathering of the Tablighi Jamaat, and they started presenting it and tracking people who participated uh, as if they were the source of the infection throughout the country. I mean, it's important to remember that even Parliament was functioning at that period, let alone anything else. There were religious gatherings and political gatherings of many kinds, but they picked up this one, and it became part of the social common sense that Muslims uh, were really the cause of the pandemic. And then fake videos, flooded social media, which showed Muslims spitting on vegetables and coughing into people's faces, and even ordinary, working class Hindus today, whom I talk to, actually believe that Muslims are the reason that the pandemic has spread. And lastly, in the last few minutes, with all of this, the government decided to use the lockdown to start arresting people for participating in the anti-citizenship amendment act. And largely they picked up students, Muslim identity students, and some left students, but mostly Muslim students in very large numbers, and they started picking up victims. And we all, I am associated with young colleagues who work on human rights. All these lawyers were locked up in their homes. They were not even allowed to extend legal defense. So they used the lockdown to actually lock up probably more than 1,000 people at that time. And they have, continued to build this environment, and now they started extending their reach. And the very last, couple of days ago, they issued a charge sheet connected with and this is the last point I make, with the violence. I had gone, in a petition to the High Court and then to the Supreme Court, saying that those who had openly incited hatred, they were leaders of the BJP, which led to the violence. No, not even a police case has been registered against them. So I went to the High Court and then appealed in the Supreme Court. In the High Court, instead, some of them filed an application saying that no, Harsh Mander had instigated hate with a speech which actually was entirely about non-violence, and it was about resistance, but it was non-violence and love and solidarity. And 2 days ago, a charge sheet has been filed, connected with the death of with the killing of one of the intelligence officers where they've named 3 people whose hate speech has instigated that violence. And I'm one of the 3 people whose hate speech has instigated the violence and led to the murder of this person. So we're talking about something very, 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 very sinister. And I believe, I said, I think before the pandemic, I would say that India's democracy was more deeply threatened at any time except the emergency. I would say now, today it stands far more threatened than even during the emergency, because the emergency at its worst was never a project of hatred. And I think that using authoritarian, political power and methods to demonize a segment of your own people in the way that this government is doing makes it more threatening than even the period of the emergency and the crisis, the humanitarian crisis that has been unleashed on, which I think will be the greatest, crisis of hunger that we will see in our lifetimes. I think India's democracy is at its lowest, at its darkest at this moment.
Thank you, Harsh, for that very, very somber, yet perhaps realistic assessment of what's going on in India, especially after the pandemic. I'm sure there will be lots of, sorry, it should be during the pandemic because we're not after it. There will be lots of questions for you, I'm sure. I would urge folks to put in their questions in the Q&A. We'll come back to the questions after both our speakers have spoken. So thank you again, Harsh. Over to you, Sabrina. The floor is yours, as usual, about 15 minutes. And then you have 5 minutes left. Either Phil or I will sort of try and nudge you. Over to you, Sabrina.
Sounds good. It's morning in Brazil, so I was about to say good morning, but I understand we're all in different time zones, so hello. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with IGDC. So thank you, Phil, Indrajit, and nice to meet you as well, Harsh. It's a very complicated time, the one that we're living in, because I kept thinking a while back that if this pandemic had happened maybe 5 to 10 years ago, probably we'd be having like a different type of handling the pandemic in our countries. Like in Brazil, for example, if this was happening under the Workers' Party, even though the Workers' Party has its own contradictions connected to development, connected to its own handling of capital and neoliberal policies and things like that, I am quite confident that we would be having a completely different management of the situation right now, and perhaps we'd have more conditions to actually ensure social isolation in Brazil. I'd like to begin with 2 things about what's happening in Brazil right now. One is the number of deaths. So we're over 40,000 deaths from the coronavirus right now. This is something that we estimate from sort of official numbers, even though that the government actually tried to suppress the numbers recently. So it wasn't able to, but they just wanted to remove the numbers. But we are quite sure that we're much above that, especially because the healthcare system in Brazil, even though it is great on paper, even though there are amazing healthcare workers in the public system that try to make it happen with less than desirable resources, we do know that the system is quite split. We have a private healthcare system as well. The private healthcare plan providers, they're very much privileged by the government in terms of like having their debts forgiven and maybe some fiscal incentives and things like that. And they can actually end up profiting very much from this. So we end up having this private and public system. And right now, one of the struggles is actually quite basic, is to make sure that we only have one ICU queue. So that, if someone needs an ICU, if it's in a private hospital or a public hospital, they'll get it independently of whether they can pay or whether they have a private healthcare plan. This situation is quite bad when we look into certain parts of the country where also people are unable to go into social isolation, either because of the way urban planning works or because they basically just have to work, because if they don't go to work, they won't be able to pay for the rent, they won't be able to pay for food. So we are in a situation right now where many of us who are engaged with some sort of political activism, we're trying to, just do crowdfunding, fundraising, raise money to buy food and get people, to, under proper, like masks and things like that, but try to deliver food to those who need it the most at the moment. So basically like a pack of rice and beans and really basic things, just to make sure that we try to help a little bit, even though we know this is not going to fix the situation. We have this thing going on, this sort of like emergency basic income. We know that it's far from ideal. It does not contemplate most people who are in need of it. There are a lot of little exclusions over there. At the same time, the federal government is trying to impose more exclusions. They're trying to reduce the amount of the emergency basic income. And ever since the beginning, ever since Congress approved it, they've been trying to basically just not pay. So trying to find some sort of obstacles or try to do a little bit of, try to force an exchange on this. So yes, we will give you money for this, but we also need this from Congress. So this is part of how things works. Our finance minister is a big fan of austerity. The Bolsonaro government was elected with help of capital in Brazil. Because of that, we do understand that the Bolsonaro government was not just a result of the conservative forces in terms of his plans of what the Brazilian people should look like or what the traditional family should be. We do know like religious religious influence is quite big. Evangelical fundamentalism is the key issue here. Evangelical fundamentalism is quite connected to racism, to sexism, to being LGBT phobic and other practices like that in Brazil. They've been going quite strong for a while. Brazil is still a very large Catholic nation, but there are a lot of estimates that say we're going to become more evangelical through the years. And the problem is not becoming more evangelical. The problem is the fundamentalism behind it. There are huge pastors and ministers who are quite rich, and they run television stations, and they've been responsible for spreading this type of thinking about what the Brazilian people should be like, what the good citizen is. This sort of rhetoric is quite strong. And they try to use it to reinforce this idea of the traditional nuclear family in Brazil. So no wonder Bolsonaro has been working with this idea of like Brazil above all and God above everything. So this is quite employed into how the government is not secular at all. This comes into the context of strong structural racism in Brazil. We do know that this is at the roots of colonization. So racism against indigenous peoples, against Black people, and also all sorts of traditional communities. This has become quite clear in the discourse of the government after we had the displeasure of watching this video of one of the ministerial meetings that Bolsonaro had, and the Minister of Education and the Minister of Human Rights. They were quite clear about how they hate terms such as indigenous peoples. They think that's a problem. And they also think it's a problem that kids from Quilombola communities, so Quilombola, they're like traditional Black communities that come from the heritage of people who were enslaved in the past in Brazil, and they're very attached to the territory, rightly so. And she was just complaining that, kids from Quilombola communities are growing up with Quilombola values. So that would have to be changed. The racism is quite strong, particularly in the periphery of the cities. So we do have all of these police operations that are going on, even though we are supposed to be under social isolation, or not according to the federal government, but at least according to science. We're supposed to be trying for social isolation, but these police operations, they have no problems just barging to people's houses, supposedly looking for drug dealers and shooting. And this has resulted in the death of really young kids. And this is the basic status quo situation in Brazil. being a Black young man makes you a target. For police violence, it makes you a target in a way that you would think that perhaps if we were the United States, people would see like how these things are very, very, very much very common in Brazil, and maybe pay more attention to it, but it's actually quite normalized in Brazil, even though Black activists have been quite strong about it, quite vocal about it. And this has led to a particular situation right now where from the beginning, the left and social movements in general, they've been talking about social isolation and the need for it. However, we do know that that was never a reality, particularly because we don't have the resources to go into social isolation. We didn't have a threat of a lockdown per se in Brazil, particularly because Bolsonaro had a quite different strategy rather than looking through like the fear of the pandemic. So let's just impose the lockdown to try to ensure that he would get more powers through that. It is my understanding that Bolsonaro is quite comfortable with the powers that he has right now. He actually governs along with the military. There are some ideas out there that, wow, if we do things, the military actually, go after a coup again. Like we had a military coup in the last century, but like they would go for a coup again. But the fact is the military is quite comfortable governing along with Bolsonaro. There's no conflict there. So if there was a military coup, this military coup would actually be against us, the people, to try to strengthen this process right now. And with this, Bolsonaro has just tried to force this dichotomy. So you would have the health, the health of the people on one hand, and we have the economy on the other hand. And he would normalize that this is just a little flu, and that if you belong to a group risk, just stay at home. So talking about like vertical isolation rather than horizontal isolation. And from this, trying to make points that, well, people are going to die anyway. This is what happens. And then after all, everyone's just going to get immunity. So the whole conversation about herd immunity that Boris Johnson was going with that in the beginning as well. And then from this, his point was that, well, people are going to die of hunger if they don't die from the coronavirus. So they have to work. There's nothing we can do. Just let people work. How can you tell someone who has to go to work in order to put food on their table that they won't be able to work? So rather than making a point that, well, the government should be helping with this, we should have proper social provision to make sure people don't have to go to work. He just basically normalized it as, well, there's nothing we can do about it. And they're trying to make things go as normal as possible. So this situation has led to, like, in the beginning of the pandemic, so like last week of March, first 2 weeks of April, a lot of different governors throughout the country, particularly governors who got elected, alongside Bolsonaro, playing the same card, supporting Bolsonaro, they decided to impose some level of social isolation for about like 2 weeks or so. About the time, the most that we had of social isolation in Brazil was an average of 60%. After that, we started like decreasing, and right now we're getting lower. So there are parts of the country right now that are about 35%, maybe 40%. Shopping malls are opening up again. So this is perhaps a good thermometer of how they want things to go back to the normal in terms of it. But at the same time, the number of deaths are just growing. And we do know that the healthcare system in Brazil, it's not capable to handle these many people getting seriously ill from the coronavirus at the same time. We just don't have the resources to do this because the government's not trying to give the resources. So austerity shapes the whole situation of this handling of the pandemic. At the same time that structural racism, militarism, at the same time that, yes, okay, I just saw the time here. At the same time, the structural racism, militarism, and the way the police behaves in Brazil is already quite clear on those terms. There's a question right now, which is, most working class people, they're not in social isolation. So why not protest in the streets? So we just had it recently, a protest. So last Sunday was a day that we had protests throughout the country. Just before it, in a few particular cities, we had some smaller protests. So like maybe like these people organizing more independently. So we saw it recently. There's because the workforce in Brazil is very informal. I believe in India it is the same. Not a lot of guarantees and workers' right. We did have a period in Brazil where we have a little bit more formal work, but we had this labor reform that was implemented after the coup against Dilma Rousseff in Brazil, and it led to a more informal workforce. And so, for example, we have the delivery guys, you know, from these big companies delivering food and things like that, and they've been asking for like basic equipment to try to be more protected when they're delivering things, and the apps, they're just not up for it. So they've been organizing. We have, you know, the Black movement is organizing throughout the country, and it got to this point that maybe we just need to take back the streets. But it's a contradiction, right? Like taking back the streets when, you know, the coronavirus and the pandemic's actually getting worse in Brazil, to the point that countries in Europe and the US, they're like, well, we're not going to allow Brazilian people to come here because look at the situation over there. We're quickly becoming an epicenter for the pandemic, at least in our continent. And one of the situations is that, well, this is contradictory, but this is what we have to deal with. So social movements are trying to come along with this in like different strategies. So like, let's send people to the streets, but not too many people. Try to keep a distance, but try to make sure that while the streets are ours, because just a few weeks ago, it was this large protest of the Bolsonaro supporters asking for the end of social isolation, asking for more powers for Bolsonaro, asking for things like AI5, which was in act that we had during the military dictatorship to basically like just end democratic rights. So we had undemocratic protests just a few weeks ago, and now we're having to have pro-democracy protests and pro-social isolation protests. So there's a discourse going through the liberal media right now. Well, so what are you doing? So you're just the same, right? So you're just the same as Bolsonaro because you're protesting under the pandemic. What happened to social isolation? What happened to those type of concerns? And then the left has to make that point over and over again, that we're actually having to protest to have social isolation because that was never provided to the majority of the country, especially working class people. So this is where we are right now. It is quite complicated to try to like figure out what Bolsonaro is going to do next. We do know they want to deepen the austerity measures as much as possible, but in terms of like whether he might come up with some, you know, more like a stronger, more punitivist approach, that is still unclear, though that is also a possibility considering how the police is militarized in Brazil, how protests were repressed by these military police throughout the country last Sunday, and how this is sort of like the modus operandi over here. This is how it works. They arrest people. There's a criminalization of social movements going on. They're used to calling social movement leaders terrorists and things like that. So, you know, it might switch. We are not sure. It also depends on how threatened he feels, because there are impeachment processes that were filed against him, but we also have an idea that he may be starting to buy the support of key people in Congress from the center right or the more moderate right through, you know, like a role in a ministry or something like that. So this is up to, you know, up to debate. Also because Temer, the previous president, the interim president, he also did that. When he was about to get impeached, he bought support in Congress. So this is basically where we are right now. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you very much. That was an absolute tour de force in 30 minutes from two speakers. Sorry, we can't give you the usual round of applause, which that merits. But thank you both for that. We've now got a chance as co-chairs, Indrajit and myself, to pose a couple of questions. I think I'm going to go first on that one. So, both really, really interesting. I might ask Harsh one first. It was a great talk on the politics of Hindutva, but you flagged one thing which you said you didn't have time to go into, which was how this intersects with neoliberalism. Please, could you just give us sort of an engagement and, if it's possible, briefly, how does this intersect with the politics of neoliberalism, or the economics too of neoliberalism? And I'll ask Sabrina one before I ask you to feedback, just so that she's got time to think about it. So it was really interesting at the end there that you brought in that connection to the politics of the military dictatorship, so AI5 and that sort of infrastructure. What's interesting, I think, to foreign observers of the military dictatorship was that not only was it a right-wing movement and a conservative movement, it was also a strongly nationalist movement with a vision of national development. So you've spoken about the politics of race and sort of fundamentalist evangelical faith. Could you also speak a bit about how nationalism feeds into the political struggle in Brazil today, please? But if Harsh could lead us off, and then we'll go to Sabrina, then Indrajit, please. Thanks.
So Phil, great question. See, India, the strange thing is that India does not have, we believe that there is a legitimate space for an economic right party. It is legitimate for, it's a legitimate debate, I believe, in an economic system which is founded on fundamental social and economic rights. You might be a market fundamentalist. That is, I think, a legitimate disagreement. What I feel is not a legitimate disagreement is whether India should have a country of graded citizenship with differentiating between the rights of people based on their religious identity, because that is core to our constitutional idea. Now, the problem is that we don't have, we're looking, if you look for a party which believes in the economic right, but retains faith and commitment to the basic principles of the constitution, we don't have that kind of party. What we are finding is a convergence of the far right in terms of market fundamentalism and neoliberalism with the far right in terms of Islamophobia. And it is that dangerous feeding of one into the other that we observe. And so we're seeing extraordinary levels of crony capitalism with a certain set of super rich people getting richer and richer. And even in responding to the pandemic, there's a great reluctance. India has the smallest relief package because they want to adhere to the old orthodoxy that we should not have a fiscal deficit, or we shouldn't tax the rich, because without which you will not be able to raise the kind of money that we needed to provide. So we have both of them coming together. And I think that is what is the peculiar convergence that we see in India, which is doubly, triply threatening to democracy.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Sabrina, could you lead us off as well, please?
Yes, that's an excellent question. It actually goes through this whole process and tries to helps you link things, what's happening right now. There's this imagery that's quite strong recently that the protest against Dilma Rousseff calling for the coup, they call it impeachment, but we know it was a coup. What happened there is that we'd have these people dressing green and yellow and carrying the Brazilian flag. So the colors of the flag, this was quite strong. The way that the Bolsonaro motto works, we know Brazil, being this idea of Brazil above all, Brazil connected to God. This has some sort of idea of a project of a nation that goes through this. And this nationalist approach is quite strong because it also comes from this depoliticized notion of what unity should look like in the country. And unity should look like the absence of difference, but not by helping fight inequality, but by just like trampling on all of the difference, because above all, you're Brazilian. So this discourse by the Ministry of Education, and most of all, he was mentioning that, like, no, I hate the term indigenous people. What you're talking about, different peoples. We're all Brazilian people. We're all Brazilian people. And it's important to understand that the Brazilian society was built on this idea of like a racial democracy, because there was a lot of miscegenation in Brazil. But this miscegenation comes from a history of violence. And this is something that's usually left out of the discourse. And it comes from a history of violence. And the Black movement, for example, in Brazil, particularly like through the work of like the MNU, which is the Unified Black Movement in Brazil, they've been trying to bring back conversation about culture and heritage that fights against this idea of a racial democracy, to explain that, no, we do have these differences, particular differences of treatment in the country. But the idea of like the nation is quite important for them to make sure that when they're like passing on like any type of economic policy, when they're trying to suppress opposition, they can just appeal to the nation. So if you're the opposition to the Bolsonaro government, you're working against the president, therefore you're working against Brazil. So what kind of Brazilian person are you? So they use this quite frequently, and it has been part of how they try to crush leftist opposition. And it has been part of this whole conversation about like what is good for Brazil. So the depoliticization of it, it's quite strong. And we had this thing in June 2013 when we had massive protests, so 7 years ago here in Brazil, that because of this rejection against political parties and the way political parties behave and all of these scandals around corruption, they started saying, no parties, no political parties. So people would have to like bring down their political party flags. We're just all Brazilian. You can't appropriate the demands here. So just all be Brazilian. Then it would say like, my party is my country. And that was like a really good opportunity. I explored that in my dissertation, and I explored that in the book as well. So like this idea of like how my party is my country depoliticized the idea of political projects through different parties. There may be a conflict and we have to decide on one of them and try to pursue one project because it's not compatible with another. So the nationalist discourse has been very well appropriated by the right, but there are Brazilian leftist forces that have tried to bring it back through this idea of like a Brazilian revolution, fighting against dependent capitalism, trying to have some sort of sovereignty in the continent, very inspired by struggles that we see like in Bolivia, in Venezuela, these struggles, against imperialism per se. So there's some dispute over this, but it's still very, very marginal. Most of the idea of nationalism in Brazil is like the complicated, bad kind, racist kind of nationalism.
Thanks. Both Harsh and Sabrina for those responses, and for in some ways your very, very stimulating sorts of interventions, both to Phil's response but also the broader presentation you made. I was particularly struck in both your presentations with the references that you made to the ways in which emotions such as fear, anxiety, these have been generated, provoked, entrenched in some ways, and there appeared, Harsh referred very explicitly to this, but so did you, Sabrina, to the question of hatred, how certain groups, people, are demonized, marginalized, and there's a narrative of almost hatred against them. Now, to sort of generate such feelings, there must be an overarching narrative of crisis, that both leaders, Bolsonaro as well as Modi, are seen to be the solution to. There's presumably some sort of broader national crisis or cultural crisis or social crisis to which Modi is seen as a solution in India and Bolsonaro is seen as a solution in Brazil. Of course, these are not real crises, perhaps, or who are we to say what's real or what's not? But there is a perception of a crisis. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little more about the crisis to which Modi in India and Bolsonaro in Brazil are seen as, the solution. What is the problem which they are addressing, which has resulted in their immense popularity? I mean, the fact is, as you have both pointed out, both these leaders have been elected by the people. There are massive popular majorities that they have in elections, and the elections have been by and large free and fair. I mean, of course, there are, one can quibble with the process, but they seem to be free and fair. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts on the overall crisis to which both leaders are seen as a solution. Maybe Harsh, if you wanted to go first, and then Sabrina, is that all right? Go for it.
So Indrajit, there's been the whole politics of Hindutva is built on a notion that the Indian Muslim is not loyal to the Indian nation, that they are the enemies within. There's also a sort of a casting of our entire history, where Mr. Modi, for instance, talks about 1,000 years, 1,200 years of slavery, while we talk about 200 years of slavery, because we believe that the British colonized us, and that could be called a period of slavery. But through medieval India, where we mostly had Muslim rulers, it was a time when it is true that they came from outside, but they made India their home. And in fact, at the time when the British came, India was one of the wealthiest and most industrialized countries in the world. And so clearly people were not oppressed. And that a large majority of the Indian people retained their Hindu faith and so on. But in their, in the alternative facts that, or the alternative history that they've built, they built this idea that India has had a continuous history of the Hindus in India have suffered in the hands of the Muslims through all of these centuries of slavery, and even after independence by this notion of secularism and equal rights to the Muslims. And their imagination is that the natural land of the Indian Muslim is Pakistan or Bangladesh, and why are they here? Whereas our notion is that India, the whole imagination of India is that an Indian Muslim can choose this as their country, and they have given a great deal, and they continue to give it. In this speech of mine, which is disputed, I was speaking to young students in Jamia Millia University, and I said that, don't let people question you any further about your loyalty to this nation. Least of all those who never took part in the freedom struggle, because this is not a party which took part in the freedom struggle. And that the rest of us who are not Muslim are Indian by chance, because this was our only country. But you are Indian by choice, because your ancestors actually had a choice between whether they wanted to live in multi-religious secular India or in a Pakistan, imagined around a particular faith. So they actually chose India, and they had a choice, and therefore their love for their country and so on. But and there's multiple mythologies that are built, and the coronavirus is only the last of them that they're reproductively irresponsible, and they have large families. Although there's enough data to show that social class Hindus and Muslims have the same kind of reproductive behavior, that they are sources of terror. But again, the data shows that actually there are many sources of terror, and not just people of Muslim identity and so on. But these myths and this hatred. So the Indian, so the Hindu is being continuously told that you are you're the majority. This is your nation, and you are oppressed in your own nation. And these other opposition political parties, in the name of the constitution, and secularism have not had the courage to stand by you. We have the courage to stand by you. I think that is the mythology. And through the pandemic, so that nobody could question a whole range of failures that they had done. They very skillfully were able to actually make them responsible even for the spread of this virus.
Thanks, Harsh. Sabrina.
This is a really good question because we've been trying to discuss here in Brazil what the alternative to Bolsonaro should be. And that calls into question why Bolsonaro got elected in the first place, right? So this is part of the challenge. So there are many forces at play, but one of the things that were quite clear from the beginning is that Bolsonaro plays on the idea of being anti-systemic, that he's the opposition to all that there is there, tudo que tá aí, that he would say. So from this, the argument would be that the system is rotten, the system is corrupt. We saw this with Trump as well. So this is quite popular in some settings in other right-wing elections as well. But one thing that we can make it clear here is that, for example, the left has failed to look anti-systemic in general, so like the hegemonic left. So that made room for, the system to also look not just like the institutions that may be corrupt, but as if the left was also this embodiment of corruption. So that worked quite well for him. Part of the discourses that we saw in the streets, the campaigns, people would be saying that we're sick of being robbed. We want the country to be better, but this idea was like about fighting corruption, but fighting corruption is getting Lula arrested, for example. So they would have certain targets. They were able to build this enemy out of a left opposition that's much weaker than they would make it look like. So for example, when they would talk about a communist threat, as if there was something as such in Brazil, really, other than like a couple of thousand communists, there's no communist threat. So they would try to play on this to try to make sure that, hey, if you're afraid of this, of what they're doing, the corruption, all of this robbery, if you want the country to get better, if you want to get out of the economic crisis, because the economic crisis is quite connected to why Dilma suffered the coup in the first place. It's connected because the pie was growing, so it was easy to make this deal with the capitalists, and then the pie started shrinking, so they just had to cut their losses. So they would have to transfer the losses to the poor. Dilma wasn't willing to go far enough on this, even though she was flirting with some austerity measures at the time. She wasn't willing to go that far. So then that's why they needed Temer. That's why they needed Bolsonaro. So, but people would be under the impression that, oh, see, the economic crisis happened because the Workers' Party, they were really bad at managing the economy. So what would the solution be? Go to the opposite. And then Bolsonaro played a good character in terms of being anti-systemic through these really outrageous things that he would say, and then just say, no, I have this guy for the economy and he's going to be good. But Harsh mentioned this in terms of Modi in India, and I think this is similar here. Bolsonaro's campaign, no talk about jobs, no talk about jobs whatsoever. So people were concerned about the economic crisis, unemployment on the rise, but he would just pretend that had nothing to do with him. And that continues to be the situation. They only approach the matter of jobs, and if it's connected to more informal labor, because that's going to create new opportunities and things like that.
Thanks, Sabrina. Thank you so much. And I think there are folks in our audience who would probably want to sort of, pursue this line a little further. There's a question we have which, suggests, wants us to think a little more on precisely this issue of crisis, because it seems that both countries were doing fairly well in the recent past in terms of economic growth, in terms of progress and development. You had the whole sort of narrative of the rising powers for both India and Brazil that emerged as, I think you meant, Sabrina, the pie was growing more broadly. And Harsh mentioned the kinds of social welfare programs that previous governments had put in place in India, which were sort of, pretty extensive, even if they weren't always implemented properly. So is it that people, what's going on? I mean, and of course, the question sort of very specifically asks, why are we choosing psychopaths to govern us? But even if you didn't want to label them in this particular way, what's going on? Why are we sort of, electing such characters, despite the fact that our recent past has been, not that bad in both India and Brazil in terms of the economic growth rates. Harsh, if you wanted to go first, and perhaps Sabrina could come in thereafter, or if you want to swap the order, that's also fine. But yeah, I see Harsh has unmuted himself, so go for it, Harsh.
Yeah, it's a question that I keep asking myself. What the, I think it's uh, to say that Modi is the problem and Bolsonaro is the problem and that is why we are suffering, I think is missing the point completely, because they are people who are chosen by significant uh, uh, segments of the population. They're not a majority because of India's very complex, first past the post. So 31% was the first round and it's about 39% or something the second time round. But it's still a significant segment of people have elected them. And I think that we need to ask why at this phase in global history are more and more people around the world getting attracted. In some countries, they're getting elected as leaders. In some, they're forming significant oppositions. Why is it that more and more people around the world are getting attracted to ideologies that promise you actually nothing more substantial than the satisfaction of hate, of identifying groups whom you can scapegoat and hate and punish, whereas they're not substantially promising you, uh, uh, you know, a better life in terms of jobs, in terms of futures, in terms of social security and protection, in terms of dignity of the poor. I think it's an extraordinarily important question, and I don't think we have full answers. I think there's been, to one part, a spectacular failure of the political center in all our countries, and of moving towards the left in carrying credibility with with large segments of the people with their alternative imagination. I think that neoliberalism also has come with a significant amount of political consensus across most of the political spectrum. So in India, all political parties, including the opposition, accept the same economic, design. They don't have a radically different economic alternative to present to neoliberalism. One has, greater degree of some degree of social protection along with neoliberalism. The other one doesn't. But it's not, the core of neoliberalism has not been seriously challenged. I don't think we have built an alternative imagination, and this is probably the time that we must do it on the other side of this pandemic. Because if there's one thing that the pandemic has shown, is that each one of these inequalities and injustices and fractures in our respective countries uh, have got, both exposed and deeply exacerbated by both the pandemic and how countries have chosen to respond to them. There's one thing that your questions haven't pointed to, and I'd just like to point them. Between our two presentations, I thought was quite fascinating. Our complaint is that we had too strict and too stringent and too punishing a lockdown. And in Brazil, it is that he was so casual that he didn't even bother to try to protect people. It's interesting that they're actually two very different stories coming from right-wing populist leaders. And I think we need to understand this difference more carefully. Our problem is that my problem with with this most stringent lockdown was that it's very designed. You give literally 4 hours to people and say that from tomorrow the entire economy is shutting down across the country, and that you have to stay at home. When I work with homeless populations who don't have a home, and I also, people who live in slum shanties, which is 30-40% of our metropolises. I mean, to imagine that somebody will stay, a family of 8 or 10 will be able to stay in a 6x8 shanty for 60 days of a lockdown, and also, have no work, have no protection, and then they have no running water. How are they going to wash their hands? So it was entirely, an imagination of protection, without which excluded the poor completely. The Prime Minister casually mentions once in his speech that let civil society take care of the poor, in the middle of all of this. So I think that here we witnessed a situation in which the government used its authoritarian capital to impose the most stringent lockdown in the world on a country with the largest number of poor people, with the smallest relief package, and is getting away with it, while it is also using this. Whereas in Brazil, there's a certain casualness. The same authoritarian power is being used to in some way, from what I heard from Sabrina, to actually to absolve yourself of responsibility. But I think authoritarianism, in the end, in both cases, feels no empathy, no compassion, and no solidarity with the working poor. And it, on the other hand, and it targets specifically socially disadvantaged groups. I think that is what is common, although the specific details may be very, very different in these two cases. The core quality of a complete, I've written about it. I call it the exile of the poor from our conscience and our consciousness. And the period of the pandemic and lockdown has shown how absolute and how unforgiving is this exile of the poor from our conscience and consciousness. I think that we see in both countries.
Thanks, Harsh. Sabrina, did you want to respond to the question as well as Harsh? The point that.
I think that point is excellent. Because this is a situation we've been trying to track this. Like our research group will have like postdoctoral fellows from throughout the global south dealing with this situation of authoritarianism, and we're always finding this common ground that there's always something related to being anti-working class. So trying to like work the workforce to death, basically, and having some sort of like element of bigotry, an element of prejudice, racism, and some sort of level. This could come from religious grounds. This could come from ethnical grounds. So, but it's always present. It's always there. And this ties into a situation like when, ever since the birth of liberal democracy, there's this idea that maybe like when these really bad people come into power, they just came and they imposed themselves. But the fact is that they made room for it. They made room for it through society, through different, values from common sense and the way it's being worked into like these ideological grounds. And they make room for it. Sometimes they even get elected. So this is a situation when we talk about the fascism in the past century, we need to talk about how they got elected in the first place. So this is a matter that I don't see this as like, wow, so this is new. This is something that's happening today, but it has to do with these sort of cycles. And I think our job is to try to identify which types of situations make room for this, make room for them, and try to make sure that doesn't happen. So like, what are the grounds for this? What are the conditions for someone like Modi to come into power, someone like Bolsonaro in Brazil, somebody like Duterte in the Philippines? And we could be talking about, the way that things are being handled in the US, in the UK, what are the conditions for a Brexit, to something that people thought, wow, that's not going to happen. Then all of a sudden, wow, it does happen. And we can just like reduce this to the moment where they had a really good Brexit campaign. We can't reduce things to that one particular moment. We need to look into this in terms of like the historical material conditions that come into power. And when I look into Brazil, I know, for example, that we didn't have at all a proper process to making sure that people know what the military dictatorship did. There's a huge level of historical revisionism in Brazil, where they are talking about the dictatorship and say, no, that wasn't a coup, that was a revolution. We were fighting the communists. So the military had to come and save the country from the big bad communists. So that resonates today to people who don't even know who communism might be in that context. That resonates today with people who are just, oh, torture, well, that happens sometimes, right? Those were the bad guys. And then sometimes we need to be like, no, children as well, and also like, what are you talking about? Like political prisoners and persecution and all those sorts of things. So this historical revisionism that happened here, I think is a huge part of why Bolsonaro got elected, how we had a truth commission, but this truth commission wasn't popularized. It wasn't we don't have a proper memory, like a collective memory of what happened. We only have individual memories that get played here and there, and some official memories that got collected. But in general, like, people just say, what? No, my dad, he lived through the dictatorship, was fine. Nothing happened to me because he was a good guy. So that things end up individualized. So there's this individualized ethics. It really helps to depoliticize things and make room for these guys.
Okay, well, thank you for both of those answers. I'm going to try and pull another one from the chat, so hopefully you can see this as I answer it live. One of our audience points out that a Brazilian arms industry named Taurus signed a joint venture agreement with an Indian company named Jindal Defense for the manufacturing of small arms quite recently. So they're going on to the militarization of politics and the economy is a transnational phenomenon that by far exceeds the far-right discourse of taking back control of the country. To kind of hijack that question a little bit, both of you have spoken really well about the national picture and national politics, but obviously both countries that you're dealing with are considerable on the international level too. They're very deeply globally integrated into the global economy, and they're very significant now, increasingly significant in international politics. So could you both maybe speak to us a bit more about the international dimension of what's happening? And can I ask, reversing order, can I ask Sabrina to come back to that first, please?
Very, very important. I think I'm going to speak from the Latin American context over here. This is something that we've been trying to understand in terms of the regional dynamics. Like before Temer, before the coup, before Bolsonaro, we had what we call here in Latin America, these pink tide governments, right? So these like moderate left governments that were popping up in different countries, and they would have some sort of alignment with each other. So, meetings and trying to think regional development and other matters, not always agreeing on things. So for example, when we look into Venezuela, we do know there were like more to the left than the Workers' Party in Brazil. So there were like different perspectives on this, but this idea of like this regional sovereignty was quite important. Brazil thought regional sovereignty more in terms of like this quick path to development, mega projects throughout, and this idea of the BRICS and trying to position itself as this emergent power. But others saw, no, we're going to fight anti-imperialism by making sure that the US cannot intervene over here. So there were different perspectives, but there was this integration. This regional integration was quite strong. So once you start getting removing one, it makes it easier for you to remove the others, and you can actually be like a house of cards. And I believe this is quite connected to this switch to the neoliberal stance here. So we can talk about Piñera in Chile, and we can talk about Macri in Argentina. Argentina now is under Peronist government, but it was under Macri before. So Macri and Temer were together during the coup. And then we can talk about Guaido coming and saying, no, he's the proper president of Venezuela. So that influences that narrative over there. And then we need to talk about Bolivia and the situation that even the New York Times right now is saying, oh, look at that. It was quite fishy, the way that Morales got ousted. Oh, I wonder why. And this kind of situation is up for grabs when it comes to like looking to, okay, so Brazil, Bolivia, Venezuela, we can talk about Ecuador, all these different countries, they were in one period and now they're like entered sort of this other period of more right-wing governments. And one thing that's quite interesting, and like people abroad may not know about this, is that Bolsonaro got elected, right? And like he already said, oh no, Guaido is the proper president of Venezuela. Evo Morales is a problem. So they were attacking these other sources, little sources of leftist governments throughout the region. And one of the things that they talk about is like trying to say like Foro de São Paulo, which is this large agreement and campaign that coordinates leftist forces throughout the continent. So that would include, for example, the Cuban Communist Party and other parties like that. The Workers' Party is a member of it. From the beginning, they were treated, wow, that's Satan. They're the enemy. They're terrible. So once they come into power, we have this thing. Bolsonaro comes, and then last year, months later, Bolivia happens, and they have Janina Reyes, and then she comes with this huge Bible. So we have these patterns over there. And then just after that happened, we had these guys try to invade the Venezuelan embassy here in Brasilia with Guaido's picture, and try to invade and say, no, we're taking over. And the Bolsonaro government just didn't want to do anything about it. We had to make a fuss about like get these guys out of the embassy. Right. So what they're thinking here is not just let's elect this right-wing government so we can all take over the region and be friends, but this has to do with particular projects. And I think one of them has to do with how nature is dealt with in Latin America. So the Amazon is part of this situation. Industrial extractivism is part of this. So rare earth minerals is part of this. Like Bolsonaro is always talking about niobio, and Bolivia, Bolivia has ground for lithium, and there's all of these minerals to be exploited. And if you have like governments that might be looking to social welfare or workers' rights, they might not be the proper governments to help with your mining. And this ties us back to how you have like Canadian mining companies trying to make sure that Bolsonaro will allow them to mine on indigenous grounds. And trying to make sure that like more indigenous territory is not actually settled, so to make things easier, right? So these resources, these natural resources in our region, they play a huge role in how these governments are popping up, because they're very, very much interested in how they're going to manage that, how they're going to privatize things. Privatization of Petrobras is something that is always on their minds, how they're going to deal with oil. So dependent capitalism is very much part of this dynamic here of like the center periphery, the imperialist interests, and like finance, even how they're connected to this switch that we had in Latin America.
Harsh, do you want to lead us off? Thank you very much, Sabrina.
Thanks. I'll very briefly say that militarism is very much part of the muscular nationalism, muscular Hindu nationalism. Militarism has always been a very aggressive militarism, has been a very essential part of this. So, the soldier is like the ultimate symbol of patriotism. And we've had an extraordinary sort of drive to actually place military tanks in universities to teach people patriotism. All of this is at a wider level. It's as if there's an obligation to hate in order to establish that you love. So you cannot love your nation without hating other nations, and you can only prove that you truly love your nation if you hate Pakistan. And in Pakistan, there's an interesting convergence of both the anti-Muslim and this militarism that comes together. And when everything else fails during the last, the second general elections, a point had come where maybe we were optimistic, but we were really believing that Mr. Modi's popularity was falling. And then he had this master stroke, which was a very, very strange kind of military strike. It's called a surgical strike on Pakistan, around which there are all kinds of questions can be raised about what actually happened. But there's no doubt that that completely changed the political tide. And he won the elections not promising jobs, not promising a better economy, but promising hatred of Muslims and hatred of Pakistan, and he won the day. Militarism is very much, and then there's the question of big capital. So we have big capital having a massive stake in India's very aggressive militarism and defense purchases. And there are many unanswered questions. The Rafale deal with France. It's in normal times a government which actually the deal initially was with a government public sector company, and that was shifted to one of the private super rich kind entities, and the deal was tied up with with great benefits to private capital in that case. So I think that there's this complex play of ideology, of the interests of big capital, and the diversion of public anger at their own situation by identifying this external enemy whenever things get particularly bad.
Thanks, both Sabrina and Harsh. I think those are very sort of points to reflect on further, and actually takes us very nicely to the next question that I want to pose, which has been asked by our audience members. You both talk about sort of the kind of hatred that has been propped up. And of course, you both told us about how Bolsonaro as well as Modi, and we see this across the world in other sort of strongman politics or right-wing politics. They have both sort of anchored their political campaigns in terms of hatred, of course, but also in terms of saying that they are on the side of the underdog, they are on the side of the subaltern, they are battling a corrupt liberal elite. Despite, of course, as you both said, they are, definitely sort of furthering the cause of the privileged, whether it's high caste or white or whatever you want to call it. So they're certainly on the side of the privileged, but there is a narrative that they are on the side of the poor, the subaltern, the underdog. Now, our audience member wants to know whether the pandemic crisis and their responses to the pandemic, and you're right that both responses are very different, but at the end of the day, as I think both of you have actually agreed, at the end of the day, they target the poor, they exclude the underprivileged, the subaltern, so to speak. So do you see that the pandemic, that their handling of the pandemic, or mishandling as it were, I think Brazil has the third highest number of cases. India has overtaken the UK to have the fourth highest. So they're both pretty much near the top. And the top is, of course, dominated by Trump and Putin. So in a sense, they're inching towards the top. So, but do you think their mishandling of the crisis might dent this very carefully crafted image that they're on the side of the poor? Because after all, the pandemic has hit the poor more than it's hit other sections of society, as these things usually do. Again, maybe I'll invite Sabrina to respond first, if that's all right, and then Harsh can come in afterwards. Sabrina.
Yes, something that we've had some polling recently to try to figure out, how much people approve of the Bolsonaro government, and we do know that his approval has fallen. ever since the beginning of the pandemic. Even right now, there's this whole conversation about like 30 versus 70%. So like 70% of people disapprove of Bolsonaro, 30% of people still approve of him. But I do like this 30% approval is like they're more loyal, is a more loyal base, but it doesn't mean that like they're all fascists and Bolsonaristas. There's different subjective understandings to what approval may mean in this case. We also know that there might be some confusion as well issue, like in terms of like what the federal government is doing, what the Congress is doing, and what state and municipal governments are doing handling the pandemic. Sometimes it's harder for people to try to separate that and see like what is actually Bolsonaro's fault. What we see is that right now, what is really at play is this conversation like meritocracy versus solidarity, sort of. So he's still very much playing into this like neoliberal ethos, into that, well, you just have to work really hard and you need to protect yourself. Like you protect yourself, you do what you can, but people are going to get sick, and there's this it's sort of desensitized when you think about it, that the poor in Brazil, they're so beaten all the time that, well, it's just another government that might not care about us. Is it enough to take it to the streets and take them out? We do know that when Dilma got ousted, it wasn't a matter of, this huge, like massive protests of working class people and the poor saying, no, Dilma, you're not good for us. It was the, upper middle class mostly going to the streets and huge resources and trying to do that. And some people say, yeah, so what is the problem? Oh yeah, corruption. Yeah, I'm against corruption as well. It wasn't like it wasn't a politicized choice for most people. And right now, in terms of, how people perceive the Bolsonaro government, I'm still unsure as to whether, those who disapprove of his handling of the pandemic see it as a problem of, the government itself and a problem of the political project. One of the issues that we have is that usually there's this whole conversation about, yeah, Bolsonaro is just incompetent because he's incompetent. And I'm always trying to stress the fact, no, he's not incompetent. He's actually quite competent at his project of negligence. He's very competent into, promoting this type of like violent politics and, the private healthcare providers in the center and the destruction of the Amazon and not caring about public education. He's quite competent in that. And that's the problem, because that's a political project. So it's quite hard to politicize in that way, because things have been very much individualized. I know that the handling of the pandemic has made him lose a part of his base. Like that has happened. People who are saying, I regret voting for him. Like, I never thought you would get to this point. I just wanted to get rid of the Workers' Party. So people, they're still sort of like center right, but ended up going too far on this. And like the challenge is to actually like get these people to understand, yes, see, this is a problem. So what's happening? They said, no, I'm against fascism because Bolsonaro is a fascist. But wait, Bolsonaro is a fascist. It means that, one of the grounds for fascism is being anti-working class, is being quite connected to capitalist forces. So you kind of need to see what's behind that as well. And this is quite hard right now, so much that we're having to try to make sure people understand that being anti-Bolsonaro and being anti-fascist is not going to be the same thing. So if you want to make the jump to be anti-fascist, you need to understand all of the forces that keep Bolsonaro like over there ruling and like saying the absurd things that he says all the time.
Thanks, Sabrina. I'm glad you brought up the F word. I'm sure we'll come back to it at some point later, but thank you so much. Harsh.
Thank you. It's a paradox that I've not found. It's a question that we are repeatedly asking. We had, the levels of human suffering that India has seen over the last 3 months, not caused yet by the pandemic. I think that we're still to see, caused entirely by by public policy choices of this very stringent lockdown, is incredible. I mean, we had 10 million people at least, and some estimates are even larger, who hit the road, walked literally 500 kilometers, 1,000 kilometers with small children, sometimes hiding in these containers on buses at huge temperatures, hunger while traveling on the trains that were ultimately started. We've seen it's one of the things that actually has moved middle class India, and it's not easy to move middle class India. The images of literally, people carrying small children, a girl of 15 or 16 cycling 1,200 kilometers with a disabled father on the back, etc. And the levels of mass hunger. I mean, I've been on the streets with my colleagues. I have not seen this kind of mass hunger in 65 years of my life in a city, where people are made to line up. Literally, for every meal, you have to line up maybe a 2-kilometer line in the hot sun, waiting for a small, ladle of food, and then you eat that, and then you go back standing in line for the next meal, and that's how you're spending day after day. I mean, by any rational calculation, there should have been huge mass anger on the streets. Even if not, not violence, and I'm really opposed to violence, I would have expected uh, uh, political resistance, voices being raised, people expressing their anger. Almost none. And there's been virtually no violence, no protests. I mean, there's one or two very small incidents happened through all of this period. And it's a great mystery. And if there is no political anger, it will not, it might even just barely singe the popularity that Mr. Modi carries. We might, I think it's something that political scientists and actually every thinking person needs to understand. I think there are many reasons for it. Very briefly, I don't think the political alternative carries any credibility. As I said earlier, they stood for the same neoliberal policies with a little more humanity. There is no conviction that if we got another political party, they would have done better for us. I think they would have, but there's no obvious. It's not obviously clear, except for the Communist Party in Kerala, which gives a very, very fine example, and I think they will get the political benefits. Nobody carries the political opposition doesn't carry any credibility. I think that the poor have reconciled in India that the state is always going to be pro-elite. The middle class are going to be uncaring. Capital will always be exploitative. And the best we can do is to survive somehow on our own. And so you're seeing greater and greater degrees of these betrayals by the rich and the middle class and by the political elite, which the working poor seem to be just dealing with it. It's like a fact of life. And we have to just learn how to become even stronger in being able to cope with all of this. So I think that it's a paradox of spectacular proportions for me. If this humanitarian crisis, and I think that now we're just reaching what the pandemic is going to do. I mean, we literally have middle class people. I'm terrified, even as a middle class person. My father's 94. He just had fever this morning, and I'm, as a middle class person, we are finding that people are going from. If I have to take him to a hospital, I don't even know if I can get him into a hospital, because people have had to move people from hospital to hospital. They're not being able to get a bed. This is the middle class. These are people who are able to pay and who have immense social capital. What is going to happen? What is happening to the working poor when the pandemic actually hits us, when we become the #1 nation, which I think is, public health people tell me is going to happen surely by July. We'll be the #1 nation, if not before that. What happens to the poor then? In all of this, there's still no political anger. You're the political scientist, you'll have to explain to me why.
Phil, you had a question to go ahead, and then maybe I'll come back later.
Yeah, I think We've got time for one more question.
Yeah, can I just respond? Yes, Harsh, I think that there's a seed of a collaborative project in that question as to why there's no anger, but thank you. Phil.
Cool stuff. Okay. So as we're nearing the end of our time, we'll try and combine two as I ask this one live. So one audience member asked about whether or not both of you could speak to the role played by the media in either getting these leaders to power or maintaining them there. But another participant also asked, can you speak to the role of political education, more or less in the same vein? So please, again, Sabrina, if you want to lead us off.
Media played a huge role into the impeachment against Dilma. Media was very, large media, very critical of the Workers' Party government, always trying to stigmatize it, criminalize in some way. This has to do with the way, landless workers movement is one of the largest social movements in the world, if not the largest organized one. It's always being criminalized from its inception here in Brazil, and media has played a huge role into saying they're invaders and criminals and things like that. So that really comes into the imaginary of people as these these people who are going to come and take your house and come and take your land, and not really understanding the process of the fact that, in Brazil, we need agrarian reform immediately. This is part of the problem that we encounter. Agribusiness helped to elect Bolsonaro. They're still very tied together, and that's why they're so threatened by landless movements like that. And what we see is that up until the campaign, most of the large media was very aligned with Bolsonaro. Sometimes there would be a little bit of criticism here and there, mostly because, some of them would be interested in electing another right-wing guy. Maybe a more moderate right-wing guy that they thought that they could work with a little better. But once it came to the second round of the elections and was between a Workers' Party candidate and Bolsonaro, they would either go full on behind Bolsonaro, or they would do something that happened quite similarly. So, wow, it's a really difficult choice, huh? It's very hard to choose between Bolsonaro and this university professor over here. So, well, we need to give another chance to, something new, someone new, because the Workers' Party was really bad. So, yeah, it's a difficult choice, but we have to go with Bolsonaro. So they try to, play this card of that, the extremes. They're quite similar, right? But I'm still going to go with the far right. The far right is still going to be our best bet right now. And this is still the discourse in some places, but it has mostly fallen apart because the Bolsonaro and the journalists and the editorial lines, they're not together at all anymore. From the beginning, Bolsonaro tried to ensure that only a few news outlets would be considered more reliable, more credible sources, those who were always saying good things about him. So those who were perhaps investigating reports of, shady deals regarding paying for this massive WhatsApp messages, trying to spread hatred and fake news. And I understand India has had the same problem with WhatsApp as well, and how all of these things get really popularized through WhatsApp. And Folha de São Paulo, for example, very bourgeois media, said bad things about Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro says bad things about Folha, and all of a sudden Folha is part of the enemy. So right now there's this switch. Most of the large media is really critical of the government, but they want to ensure that if Bolsonaro, if you get rid of Bolsonaro, be through an impeachment or an election or whatever, it is a moderate right person who gets into power after that, not a moderate left. So they're still very much anti-leftist. They're still very much trying to make these comparisons. Also, the problem is Bolsonaro and the left. So we need something else. We need those people to be more dialogical and work in the middle. And so the media definitely has changed. But it's important to understand that Bolsonaro kind of works like Trump here. His main source is Twitter. So if people want to know about Bolsonaro, Twitter. And he's always going about, this guy here, you can still listen to this guy. because this guy's on my side. And if anyone shifts a little bit into terms of criticism, he tries to destroy that person. So he has lost allies along the way because of this. But most of the time is this thing of the, like, you know, I'm the official source and all of the media that is against me, they're all leftist. So right now when he's getting a lot of criticism in international media, he's just going around saying, you know, but they're all controlled by leftists anyway. And this is how it plays out over here.
Okay, thank you for that. And
Oh,
Harsh.
sorry, I didn't respond to the thing about political education. I just,
Yeah, please do.
yeah.
Another minute.
Just in the matters that, like, Brazil, we have a problem here just in terms of like public education that gets in the way of politicization in general, but also, like, it is my diagnosis that in terms of how the Workers' Party and other more moderate left parties that were in power, they did not engage that much with political education. They did not engage that much besides participation through social movements here and there. So like people who are already organized politically, or some experiences such as participatory budgeting, where people would come and like take part into deciding the budget of their cities. There wasn't this engagement of like educating people about capitalism, about, you know, why agrarian reform is needed and we need to start working towards it, and why we need to be aware of like finance and how the interest rates work and things like that. It was mostly this whole idea that we're doing the best for the country, this is development, and then that are being like sucked into a lot of different other meanings. And I think that also made room for how the right was able to get these ideas ended up getting like emptied out during the process and filling it up with other depoliticized meanings along the way.
Okay, well, thank you. That's a really comprehensive answer. So Harsh, over to you, please.
India, you know, what Sabrina called the big media, actually they're broadly just two kinds. One kind is one that is very careful not to criticize the ruling establishment, in fact, and to echo the government point of view on every policy, on every stand that it takes, and to celebrate it. You know, that is the relatively moderate among the big media. And then you have the other side of the big media, which actually actively promotes hatred against Muslims. So for instance, when this whole business about the Tablighi Jamaat, this Muslim fundamentalist group which had a gathering, and the idea that so day after day after day you had very shrill, hysterical sort of series of television anchors talking about the Tablighi Jamaat and you know, using even the graphics were very sort of Islamophobic, and they actually advanced the hatred even more actively. So broadly, we're finding almost the entire big media is very, very careful not to criticize, and is broadly supportive, and some segment of it is actively you know, advancing hatred and the most extreme part of the ideology of the ruling establishment. As somebody who's you know, an op-ed writer, there are fewer and fewer places that I find I am able to publish. There are probably just two major newspapers who are still able to carry me, and I think they also do it with a lot of thought and careful, you know, weighing before. So you know, very, very just reasoned, evidence-based criticism of the government has become almost extinct in mainstream media. And that collapse, I think, has cost India's democracy very, very dearly. Indrajit mentioned that I decided to leave the Indian civil service after the 2002 massacre in Gujarat, which was a very, very dark moment where we had a very large state-sponsored, state-enabled massacre where Mr. Modi was the chief minister of Gujarat. But when I recall those times, I recall a time when there was large segments of the media actually investigated, spoke out. You know, in the very newspapers which today you're seeing silent, were those who were willing to call out governments at times when the country needed their speaking power, truth to power, and on corruption issues, etc. There seems to be a substantial abdication of this responsibility of independent media. If we didn't have some online portals, we'd have been in a desperate situation today in terms of voices of speaking on behalf of people, eh, of the working people, or on behalf of the minorities, or on behalf of truth in general.
Thank you, Harsh. Thank you, Sabrina, as well. We are nearing the end of our session. It's, I think, just a couple of minutes, but I cannot resist the temptation of bringing back the F word that Sabrina introduced earlier. Now, there's a great deal of discussion and debate about whether Brazil and India are sort of heading towards fascism. Some of our audience members have asked this question, at least in terms of, do you see these do you see the two countries firmly on the trajectory towards fascism? Are they fascist already? A lot of our intellectuals tell us that we shouldn't use the term fascism very loosely. I think Perry Anderson sort of said that the situation in Brazil is nowhere near fascist. It's a lazy label. Ramchandra Guha in India sort of advised students against using the term fascism. But there are, of course, a lot of others who say, well, if this is not fascism, what is? Very quickly, in one sentence, I'm sorry to push you, in one sentence, which side of this debate do you sort of see yourself veering towards? Do you think that those who using the F word are being alarmist or have got it wrong? Or do you feel that there is something about it? I'm not asking you to identify yourself one way or the other, but do you see some merit in those sorts of allegations? Maybe we can go with Harsh first, since he's unmuted already, and then Sabrina. Harsh.
Yeah. No, I
one sentence.
I think I do believe that India's polity today has many elements which are fascistic, and the great danger to India is not just from political fascism, but from the whole social movement of the RSS. The largest, it's a very powerful grassroots organization across, small towns, villages, and big cities, of people deeply committed to fascist ideologies. And I think that is what is. So Modi is far more dangerous than Trump, because Trump does not have an organization like the RSS.
Thanks, Harsh. Sabrina.
We're nowhere under a fascist regime, but there are fascist ideas running through this government, and they are keen of implementing a fascist regime if necessary. So my idea behind this is that if we want to prevent that, we need to start working on anti-fascism before that. Because the best way to fight the fascists is not letting them get completely consolidated into power, right? I think that would be the best strategy.
Great. Well, thank you both. So there are sort of lots of work to be done on this by everyone, intellectuals, academics, activists, and people, and political parties, of course. So anyway, thank you so much. I'm really sorry we have to come to the end of this very, very simulating conversation. Our audience members have been very active, asking lots of questions. So I would really like to thank our audience members for remaining engaged throughout. Obviously, a big thank you to both you, Sabrina, and Harsh, for taking time out and sort of being with us. Thanks to all the colleagues at the IGDC who sort of made this possible, who sat with Phil and me late last evening after a sort of tiring Thursday night to take us through the ins and outs of Zoom. So thank you, Minna, Tara, and everyone as well. And of course, thanks, Phil, for sort of, being on this so actively. I want to very quickly plug the next two seminars in this series. We have on the 29th of June, Christine Wallace, who's the chair of the IGDC External Advisory Board and is a former DFID advisor, who will be talking about the pandemic and the development industry. And further down the line, on July 7th, we have our very own Jessica Omkuti, who's a postdoctoral researcher at IGDC, who will be talking about climate justice. So I think details will be available on the IGDC website. But again, can I thank both Harsh and Sabrina heartily for giving us the time to reflect on democracy and authoritarianism, referring to questions of populism, fascism, and thinking through these big words through the very, very specific examples, illustrations that you've given in the context of the pandemic. Thank you very much. I wish we could have given you a standing ovation, but well, such are the times. Take good care, everyone, and stay safe.